Morning team, welcome to another ATP geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. Thank you very much for tuning in. We're going to a Ukraine war news update, first part thereof, for the 5th of October 2023. I don't know which channel this video will be on. My videos are starting to be released first time after an awful lot of scraping. It takes a long time. But my ATP Geopolitics channel is starting to be at least somewhat usable. Again, they don't seem to like my first video of the day, which is this one, even though I really try not to show anything dubious. Nonetheless, let's go to where we normally start. Ukrainian general staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before, and we are seeing quite a high number or quite high numbers in a variety of these categories here. We've got 580 personnel lost, as according to the Ukrainians, which is getting towards 600, higher than it has been for some time. 12 tanks, that's a fairly significant number, actually. 12 tanks, if you think of 12 tanks, God, the UK lost 12 tanks in one day. That's half our army gone. But no, 26 armoured personnel vehicles. Okay, that's a mix of IFVs, APCs, and MRAPs, infantry fighting vehicles, armoured personnel carriers, and mine resistance ambush protection vehicles. All of those are obviously very useful vehicles for the Russians or any army to use. They have a variety of different utilizations, and you see MRATs being used to transport troops around, and they are better protected against mines exploding underneath them. They're kind of like armored personnel carriers, but designed to withstand mines particularly. Armored personnel carriers are generally wheeled, but they don't have to be wheeled vehicles, usually without any big armaments on top. They might have a very small armament. And then an infantry fighting vehicle is sort of like an armored personnel carrier. It can take people in it, but it generally has some significant armament on top, whether that be a wired optical, missile system on top, or some heavy autocannon. But just to remind people, I know have new viewers and whatnot. So 26 of those being lost in one day is a really significant number. That's a huge loss. And it then prompts us to ask, well, why is that? What's happened yesterday? What's the story behind these numbers? So there's obviously been some pretty heavy fighting taking place. Maybe the Russians have been counterattacking big time in a number of areas in order to lose those vehicles. It seems more likely that the Russians lose vehicles like that when they are attacking rather than defending. I think it's more unlikely that you lose vast numbers of vehicles in a defensive posture if you're sitting in your trenches and whatnot. And we do know that Russians are counterattacking in places. We know that, I think, Verbove and the Robotina area, the Russians are counterattacking, so they could have lost a lot there. 31 artillery systems is another really heavy day for losses in that category. Just some huge, consistent degradation of the Russian artillery capability. 2 multiple launch rocket systems can be added to that. 8 drones, and then 18 vehicles and field tanks. Actually, that's less than we've seen in recent times. I mean, it's still significant. That's mainly going to be, sort of, to be honest, Bukankas, civilian SUVs and whatnot being used for logistics these days. They've attrited away so many of their military trucks, although there'll still be some of them, no doubt, too, and 2 pieces of special equipment. So I think that's a really challenging day for the Russians. We've seen a couple of days where things have really ticked up. And, the question is, well, what exactly is going on? And the other question is, as always, are these claims credible? What the Ukrainians claiming anywhere near accurate? And I think I've been trying to work this out for a year and a half, and I keep providing, hopefully, rationale and evidence to suggest that, yes, they are at least pretty accurate, and they're damn sight more accurate than the Russian claims. How do we know this? Well, yesterday I talked about how Andrew Perpetua counted 15 destroyed vehicles in one sort of attack of the Russians, which the Ukrainians claimed there were 15 destroyed vehicles, and so his video evidence matched. He had evidence for each one of those losses, and they matched the Ukrainian claims, and that's happened a number of times. So you start building up a probability evaluation of their claims. And here we have Andrew Perpetua's list again, where you're looking at the ratio, and this is maybe a 5-to-1 ratio of Russian losses to Ukrainian losses. So that's going to be significant. What are most of the reasons these were blown up? Well, FPV drones figures prominently there. Gimlers as well. I'm seeing a lot of HIMARS strikes or Gimlers guided multiple launch rocket system. I often use the term HIMARS, but actually HIMARS are a wheeled version, really, of the tracked M270, which is still they're both guided multiple launch rocket systems, but the HIMARS is just seen as more mobile because it's on wheels, right, and it can get out there pretty quickly. So, but I'm pretty sloppy, and I use the term for both, so excuse me on that. But we are seeing a lot of HIMARS Gimlers being used to take out individual pieces of kit. And that's what you see there. Okay, so a lot of artillery being lost, and then that proportionally represents the statistics we see from the general staff of those GSINT B. So fairly sizable bits of kit. Yeah, and then a couple of tanks, few IFVs, and some civilian vehicles. Pick up loaf. So that's a Bukanka style van. A loaf mullet. He's got names for all these different types of. The Bukanka is a loaf. I mean, it looks like a loaf of bread, right? So that's why they call it the loaf. It's like the Scooby-Doo van, essentially. As far as the Ukrainian losses are concerned, a book decoy has been added, so you can take that off, really. And then you've only got 3 losses: a boat, surveillance and comm, equipment, and a civilian SUV. So those are really minimal losses. Now, if there are attacks going on in the Verbovy area, you would expect there to be possibly some loss. I mean, it goes back to my original point, though. If the Russians are attacking, then Ukrainians might not be committing lots of vehicles to defending, right? They'll just try and suck that up. I don't know. But whatever the situation is, it appears that there's far less evidence of Ukrainian losses than there are of Russian losses. Okay, Anton Gerashchenko says, reportedly in a drone attack on Belgorod region of Russia, and I missed this yesterday. I reported this drone attack, and that footage, actually, I showed you that footage. I didn't really play it because it's just like in the dark with the sounds. But apparently it's an S400 battery that was taken out in Belgorod. I don't know how much of the system was taken out, but as I've told you before, that's a $1.2 billion system. S400 is your best air defense system that Russians use. I mean, as I keep saying, there are theories about S500, but I don't know that any are in workable existence. Russian Telegram channels reported that about 20 explosions were heard in the area where the system was located. There was a power outage in settlements nearby, and this is a second Russian Triumph complex destroyed in the past month. Actually, arguably third, right? First one was in Yevpatoria on September the 14th. So we have arguably 2 batteries. Well, I don't know that visual evidence really confirms that 1 battery was taken out in Crimea, but yeah, and then arguably another one in Kherson as well, although they might be S300s if I remember correctly. So nonetheless, the point is that Ukraine are degrading Russian air defense capabilities, not from SEAD attacks or DEAD attacks, which is suppression of enemy air defense, destruction of enemy air defense that you'd see from aviation. These are things like, you can see here, drones. We've seen Neptune missiles being used. We've seen all sorts of different munitions being used against these systems. But yeah, this is a high value system within Russian territory, and where we see ones being taken out in, for example, Crimea, the Russians will have to bring another system in to replace that, because Crimea is such a high value area, high value target, being Sevastopol. You need S-400 supporting that, protecting that. So they have to bring them in from somewhere else. So if you're going to hit them somewhere else, then Russia is going to be scrabbling around trying to find S-400 systems. This is really good. So when you talk about the counteroffensive as a whole and what the metrics of success, we talk about territorial gain. Territorial gain is, sorry to repeat myself, but it is, although it's the overall objective is that Ukraine takes back all their territory, right? So that's the number one objective, but it's not their pressing objective. So actually, you can shelve that objective for now, even though it's the big one. It then gets split into subcategories that feed into that big one. And the sub-objectives, if you like, are things like destruction of, degradation of Russian armor, degradation of Russian air defenses, attrition of their troops, hitting of supply and logistics, hitting of command and control. Take, for example, the HQ in Sevastopol, naval HQ, so on and so forth. You do all of those things. If you do all of those things really, really well, then you can just walk back your territory. You can just, right, we've destroyed everything. We're just going to walk along. We might have to be careful about mines, and there might be a few troops here and there, but you know what? We'll get our territory back. It's absolutely vital all those things are put in place. But what the problem was is that everyone's pressuring Ukraine, and they're pressuring themselves probably, to go and get the territory back as they're doing these other things. But of course, if you haven't done those other things, then attempting to take the territory back will cost you human lives and a lot of equipment that you're being given. But I'm going to repeat myself on what I said yesterday and the day before, which is I think Ukraine should just sit back, do some probing attacks now and again, but essentially sit back for 4 months until next spring comes, and in those 4 months, absolutely hammer the heck out of everything they can, and so that when spring comes, Russia just has no armor, has no air defenses, and because it's got no air defenses, logistics are being hit and command and control are being hit, and they are basically crippled. You do that really well, which means giving them all the ranged missiles. It's not so important that we give them really good tanks at the moment, in my opinion. Far more important that we give them every missile we can get our hands on, and give them airframes to be able to shoot these missiles. Those two things together, you just sit back, and it might take a bit longer than people are happy for, but sit back and you do all that. And this is what happens. You get an S-400 system taken out in Russia, and that is significant, right? So, Security Service of Ukraine reports the destruction of a Russian S-400 Triumph. Drones of the Ukrainian Security Service hit the Triumph near Belgorod last night, actually the night before. Right, then we've got Ukrainian HIMARS, as you can see there, taking out bits of kit. These are two Russian UR-77 line charge launchers. So these are demining vehicles that you would normally use to chuck up a 100-meter line full of explosives, and then you let it lie down in a straight line, and you blow it up, set off the charges, and that destroys any mines that are in that area. And then you kind of plow your way along that just for safety. You can't just drive over that, but if it's missed anything, you might blow up. So you might want to plow over that, and then you set the line charge off again the next 100 meters, and you create a path through the fields, right? But these are also being used, and apparently these are being used, as it says here, by Russians to attack Ukrainian fortifications. So if you send that line over and you can get it to some Ukrainian or Russian, depending on which side you are using these on, you can land them on your dugouts and blow out the dugouts. We saw these being used by the Ukrainians in Bakhmut, where they sent some down a street, and it blew up, each side of the street. So any troops in those buildings were kind of no more. So we have seen these being used as offensive weapons as opposed to demining vehicles. So Ukraine has taken two out with HIMARS, and again it goes back to this idea of using HIMARS for arguably lower value targets. Does that mean that high value targets within HIMARS range have all been taken out, or does it mean that actually these supposedly low value targets are indeed actually high value targets, and Ukraine desperately needs to degrade the Russian armor? Possibly both. Okay, let's go on to distance strikes. So the Air Force, not that HIMARS weren't distance strikes, but you know what I mean. The Air Force reported that 24 of 29 attack drones were shot down over Ukraine overnight. So that's last night. They are consistently throwing these drones. The theories are that they are making these indigenously now. So Iran have assisted Russia in creating a factory and giving them permission to make these themselves, although I think they are adapting them slightly, possibly even making them more cheaply, which is that's not a criticism. That's that's great. You can make them cheaper, cheap and cheerful, low cost, high effect. Air Force has reported 24 of 29 of these being taken down. So again, that's fairly good interception stats, and I've done an extra with this, but I don't think my extras are taking like 3 days to appeal. So I'm having to record them 3 days in advance, and then they're popping up. So today's extra is scheduled, but it was recorded 2 or 3 days ago. Nonetheless, the one about interception rates for these, it will be coming out soon. So that's pretty good, but still 5 getting through, 5 finding their targets, whatever those targets are. So that is a bit of a worry. Russian media, meanwhile, write that 67 settlements were left without electricity after an attack by Ukrainian drones. The governor of Bryansk region reported shelling of the border village of Suzemka. So, things are going both ways. Last night around 12:15, the Russians launched a missile attack, preliminarily the S-300 air defense system, on the village of Pecheniga in the Chernihiv district. Hits were recorded on the territory of the country village. 2 houses were damaged. So a lot of S-300s are still being used. These surface-to-air missiles that are used in a ground attack mode that are less accurate, but they still seem to be, I don't know, it doesn't matter whether they're accurate because they appear to be just firing them into residential areas anyway. Right. Early this morning, Ukrainian drones attacked substations in Sudzha and Glushkovo in the Kursk region of Russia. A total of 67 settlements reported without electricity. So again, it looks like they're hitting things like electricity substations. They're doing what Russia did last year to Russia, although it looks like a lot smaller scale, but still having an effect. Explosions are reported in Sevastopol, near Kazachaya, Cossack Bay. Those Crimea is still being targeted. And here we have Andrew Perpetua again talking about the massive challenge that Russian aviation is providing for Ukraine. These FAB 500 bombs are, and bigger, so the 1500 variant as well, are an absolute, thorn in the side is underselling it, really. So I think this is one of the biggest problems, and I've been banging on about this now for some time. The reason Ukraine needs more Patriot batteries, agreed, and the latest modern F-16, agreed. These are the airstrikes, just the reported ones, by the way, for September. There are 840 markers, many of which represent multiple strikes. So in other words, it's not 840 bombs, that's arguably like 1,600 bombs dropping here, perhaps. And especially when you consider that these are the only ones that have been, these are ones that have just been reported. There are others that won't have been reported. The volume of these strikes is staggering. Not only the destructive power of the bombs that are used, and he can closer looks. You look at this. So, and I've got some footage of Berislav, which is along here. Might even be, is it one of these? No, but this is along the Dnipro River. Just the sheer volume of these strikes on these individual towns mean that there's going to be nothing left of these towns, or it's just incredible, absolutely incredible. There's Berislav. So Berislav has been hit today. If we go and look here, Russian strategy in Ukraine is now just to destroy the country. Last night, Russia sent FAB guided bombs to destroy neighborhoods in Berislav. No military objective, just destroy. If Ukraine got longer range fire, these aircraft could no longer do this. This is the importance of having a Patriot system, something like that nearby. So Andrew Perpetua is clocking these, and it's really interesting analysis, because this is the Robotina area, and look how they are using them on Ukrainian troops. You wonder why Ukraine is struggling to advance quickly. Well, if they're getting this many massive bombs dropping on them, that's essentially the same as Russia having air superiority. It is a form of air superiority, right? Instead of having close air support, though, it's not CAS, close air support, where you've got planes and helicopters maybe coming in and supporting your troops and precision hitting certain targets as your troops are attacking. These are being dropped from 70 kilometers back or whatever, and these are glide bombs that are then gliding in. But if the effect is pretty much functionally the same, then this is arguably air superiority, and that is a huge worry. So this is where the Ukrainian soldiers and vehicles are attacking. This is where they're staging, and there will be a huge loss of both life or logistics or equipment. And then you're like, oh, I wonder why the Ukrainians are taking so long to take ground. Well, here's one of the reasons. Okay? And then you look at Orikhiv. So this is Orikhiv, which is just back from where we were there. So go back to Orikhiv here. So this is Orikhiv, isn't it? So that's Orikhiv, I believe. Just behind the where we are there, and you can see further along too. So Orikhiv then is being absolutely leathered with airstrikes, just really under pressure. And then you've got Touretsk, which is up sort of south of Bakhmut, that's getting hammered. You can see, in fact, that's Mayorsk here, which is where the railway comes down. You've got Ozerianivka there, just below Kurdyivka. This is where Turetsky is, and you've got New York nearby. This is getting hammered as well. That general area. These are big, significant bombs. I know I'm spending a lot of time on this, but it is that important that we understand the true magnitude of how Russia are using these FAB 500s, and the US equivalent, the JDAM, is not being effective for the Ukrainians because it is essentially jammed by electronic warfare more effectively than these are. And I think, as I've said, this is a bit speculation, but Andrew Perpetua, I think, was saying this, that it appears that the JDAMs, if they are messed with electronically, they kind of shut down and they disconnect the fuse for safety, yeah, so it doesn't go off and blow up some innocent village, right? But the Russian version, the FAB 500, I don't give a toss, right? So if that gets electronically interfered with, it's still going to drop and explode vaguely near where they were intending. So it kind of almost does the same anyway, especially if you're aiming it for the middle of a town and you don't really bothered about where it's going to hit. Okay, just coming on to final sort of strikes part here. This is annoying me. I don't know why this has happened, but I don't know whether it's Musk having something to do with this, or Twitter or X has changed articles so they no longer have the headlines. Why would you do that? The reason I click on an article is because I know what it's about. So if it's taken away the headlines and just has the name of the media source here. So I did this last night where it did have the article name, and then it's changed. And now Ilya Ponomarenko said the new way Elon's toy shows links to news article is weird. So anyway, this goes out for everyone asking why Ukraine delivers strikes on Russia's Black Sea fleet and how it helps. This aspect of Ukraine's defensive effort is indeed largely overlooked. So this is about the success, as a Wall Street Journal, about the success of the Ukrainian kind of strikes in the Black Sea area. So let's just dip into this a little bit. Russia has moved powerful vessels, including 3 attack submarines and 2 frigates, from Sevastopol to other parts in Russia and Crimea that offer better protection, according to Western officials and satellite images verified by naval experts. The Russian MOD didn't respond to a request for comment. Who knew? The move represents a remarkable setback for Russian President Vladimir Putin, whose military seizure of Crimea in 2014 marked the opening shots in his attempt to take control of Ukraine. His full-scale invasion of last year has now boomeranged, forcing the removal of ships from a port that was first claimed by Russia in 1783 under Catherine the Great. The withdrawal from Sevastopol follows a series of strikes by Ukraine in recent weeks that severely damaged Russian vessels and the fleet's headquarters. The immediate military effects of the move are limited, as the ships will still be able to fire cruise missiles on civilian infrastructure such as ports and power grids, naval experts said. Ukraine's strikes had already broken the fleet's blockade of Ukrainian ports, denying Russian access to ports of the Black Sea and opening a new corridor for Ukraine to dispatch economically vital grain shipments. More on this later. But the withdrawal is a timely boost for Ukraine as its counteroffensive advance is more slowly than planned, amid heavy losses and political ructions in the US, raised questions about funding for Kyiv's efforts to expel Russian occupying forces. And there's lots of analysis here, worth a read. Does go on to say at the end, a Ukrainian military spokeswoman said Wednesday that Ukraine has pushed back the front line in the Black Sea to at least 100 nautical miles from Ukraine's shorelines. Russian ships no longer go beyond Cape Tarkankut, that's a western side of western cape of Crimea, at the western end of the Crimean Peninsula, said Natalia Humenyuk, a spokeswoman for the Ukrainian Southern Defense Forces. Quote, currently ships and boats of the Black Sea Fleet of the Russian Federation do not actually sail in the direction of the territorial sea of Ukraine, said, so on and so forth. So lots to read about in there. And in fact, we're going to come back to Crimea in a second. Right. Russian forces have expanded fortifications along the border with Ukraine in recent months. So that's on the Russian border. The updated map shows many of these new defenses and links them to satellite imagery. There are also new defenses, elsewhere within Ukraine too. So this, unfortunately, the slow-moving counteroffensive allows the Russians to continue building their defenses, which are ultimately a real pain in the ass for the Ukrainians. Okay, Zelensky has admitted holding presidential elections in Ukraine in conditions of war. According to him, it is necessary to fulfill a number of conditions for this. Right, I've done a part of an extra on this that's coming out in the next few days where I have a right old whinge about pro-Kremlin voices in my threads. You know who you are. Spouting off about how Zelensky's a dictator because he won't hold elections. Right, one, it's the Ukrainian constitution, you dolts. Okay? Ugh. I hate this disinformation talking point nonsense, right? He's not holding elections because it's against the constitution. The country is under martial law. It's at war, spending money and time. Like, if he's going to go out on a campaign trail for a month, right? What's he doing, like, trying to get aid for his country? What's he doing trying to keep his country together in a time of war? You don't hold elections because it's a waste of money, waste of time, and it's counterproductive for defensive war efforts. In the UK, we didn't have elections from 1935 to 1945. We didn't have elections for 10 years. Why? Because the Second World War got in the way, and that wasn't even in our country, right? Our country was at war, but we weren't invaded. This country is both at war and has been invaded, and you're expecting him to have elections. You absolute idiots. But anyway, because there's pressure for him to hold elections so that it looks more democratic, even though it's against the constitution and against common sense. Quote, the situation is difficult, but elections in Ukraine can take place if Parliament manages to solve all the tasks to ensure access to voting. It is important to organise elections in a secure way for people who have to vote without being attacked. We have this task, but if our country manages to make changes to the laws, elections will take place in Ukraine. In other words, yeah, we can conceivably do it, but man, we've got a lot of logistics to organise. And again, is it a good use of money? Right, going back to Ukraine, there was this talk about, so the Russians claimed that they repelled a Ukrainian attack on the western Tarkhanku Peninsula of Crimea, and that there were 3 jet skis and a boat, and they blew up, and they repelled it, and they killed someone and all sorts of stuff. Turns out it was actually much more than that. And how do we know that? Because the Ukrainians have released evidence of it, like video evidence, really good, thermal imagery as well, which is why Trent Telenko says Ukrainian SSO has drones with thermal cameras as their air cover for the Crimean landing. There are a lot of implications in that, starting with, where's the Russian air defense? I bet people can respond to this post with a lot more than just that, but this is the GUR released footage of a landing operation of Ukrainian SSO units in occupied Crimea. Unfortunately, as they were driving away, someone fell off the back of a jet ski and was subsequently captured, so that's a real shame. Special forces of the Stugnat and Brotherhood battalions landed on the territory of Crimean Peninsula and inflicted fire damage to the occupiers. So I don't know exactly what the objective was, and I don't know what the targets were and what they achieved. However, it seemed fairly successful. They were then, as you would expect, repelled. This kind of thing is never going to be anything other than a raid, so they're never going to stay there, right? That's just completely ridiculous because they'll just get killed. You've got a small group, some kind of DRG, deep reconnaissance group, or some kind of objective to blow something up or make a statement. I don't know what it is. They go in, they do their stuff, and they get out. That's your classic raid, and they appear to have done that pretty successfully, and then hopped on back to the rigs that are out in the Black Sea that they now control. These are very useful for allowing them to do things like this. And those rigs also keep the airframes away from attacking. But then they also, at the same time, were sending missiles across to hit targets in Crimea, which also keeps the airframes away because the Crimean Russian air defense systems are firing at the air. And if you have one of their airframes in a way, they're going to accidentally target their airframe potentially and take out their own airframe. So the airframes have to stay away. So it's quite a clever conjunction there for the Ukrainians so that they can do an attack like this. Anyway, go and watch reporting from Ukraine's video from last night. It details it a lot better than I. Obviously, always take anything with a pinch of salt in terms of how positively things are being spun and whatnot. But it certainly looks like this was a pretty successful incursion or raid, and that the Ukrainians are still doing stuff like that. Yeah. Right. Russia intends to install sea mines on the approaches to Ukrainian ports to prevent the export of grain through the temporary humanitarian corridor. This was reported by the press service of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Great Britain. British intelligence believes that Russian Federation is trying to endanger civilian vessels passing through the humanitarian corridor. Nothing surprising about that. Trent Telenko reporting here, we shall see people who are genius level skill set at one thing can be complete fools in another. Yep, sorry to mention Elon Musk again, but actually this is interesting. I'm trying to work out what's going on here. So David D, who's a source I sometimes dip into, says, I predicted this a while back. Once pressure builds and others bash him in the head and he sobers up, we will probably see him shift in his thinking. I don't think he talks to many people outside of the bubble of friends. I bet that bubble just popped. I hope we will see. And I kind of agree. Like we all stay in our information bubbles, and that's why sometimes we need to venture out because we get a reality check. And that includes with just watching my channels. Go and watch plenty of channels, and you'll get a good sense of what's going on. Elon, I'm not stupid enough to demand of viewership that you can only watch me because I am right or whatever. That's obviously ridiculous. So I've got my biases. I've had my selection biases on my sources. You need to go and check other people out and get a proper sense of what is going on, or hopefully a really good sense of what is going on. Elon Musk, I don't think does that at all. So he just sits in this bubble, talks to the same kind of people, and comes out with garbage in, garbage out. You come out with nonsense conclusions. But something's happened. So he's now said, I agree with supporting Ukraine and do, but American matters should obviously take priority. So he's like, I still think like the southern wall in the US is important. These things aren't, it's not either or. It's a false dichotomy, is what it's called. So you get a lot of Republicans in America saying, and they've said it on my threads yesterday. I literally have spoken to people about this. Like, we can't do this in Ukraine until we sort our southern border out. It's like, what? They're two completely different funding streams. No, it's nothing. What? One is international geopolitical strategy. You don't sit there and go, right, we're not doing anything else in the world. We're not gonna do healthcare until we sort out the southern border. No, but you can do healthcare and the southern border. You can do geopolitical strategizing and supporting Ukraine and the southern border. Stop connecting these together. It's called a non sequitur. One doesn't follow one from the other. These unconnected it's a logical fallacy of a red herring. They're just unconnected. But if you connect them, that is a false way. That is a disingenuous way of just stopping funding for Ukraine. Really, you're saying, I don't want to fund Ukraine. How can I not fund Ukraine? Okay, I'm going to connect it to this thing over here and say, if you don't do this thing over here, then you shouldn't have that. Two arguments, mate. Two separate arguments. I'm not saying that southern border doesn't need attention. You don't need to sort that out. It's not an either or. Both and. Anyway, but he's starting to couch his language a bit differently. So that's interesting. I don't know if there's pressure or whether he's talking to other people or what. Anyway, thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, share. Take care. Speak soon.